Tonight, we drift quietly across the endless gray waters of the early 18th century. When the age of empires met the age of desperation, the wind moves lazily over the surface of the sea, carrying with it the faint smell of tar, salt, and smoke. The waves rise and fall in slow repetition, each one dissolving into the next, as if time itself has grown tired of movement. Somewhere in that monotony, the faint outline of a ship appears. A ship without a flag, without a nation, and without mercy. It is here that the story of the pirate truly begins, in the imagination of later centuries. Pirates became creatures of adventure and rebellion, painted in bright colors on maps and movie screens, celebrated as symbols of freedom. They laughed in the face of kings, they plundered gold, they sang as the cannons roared. But the reality was quieter, darker, and far more human. The life of a pirate was not a life of adventure, but a slow, grinding existence between hunger and hope, lived out on splintering decks that creaked like dying lungs. The world that created them was already sick with inequality. The oceans of the 17th and 18th centuries were ruled by empires: Britain, Spain, France, the Netherlands, each clawing for wealth, land, and sugar. Merchant ships crossed the Atlantic heavy with goods, and behind them came the shadows, men who had been beaten, underpaid, or simply discarded by the same powers that sent them to sea. They were sailors who had lost their wages, soldiers abandoned after wars, convicts who had escaped, or men who had nowhere left to go. To those who looked from the shore, piracy seemed like freedom, the chance to live without masters. But on the open water, freedom meant little. It meant no protection, no food supply, no law, except the rope and the knife. The sea did not care for freedom. It only demanded endurance. Imagine standing barefoot on a wooden deck under the burning sun. The boards are hot beneath your feet, the tar soft and sticky. The salt in the air cuts at your lips. Around you, everything creaks. The rigging, the masts, the hull itself. A constant groaning chorus that never stops. The sails, patched and dirty, flapped weakly in a wind that smells faintly of decay. Each movement of the ship sends a slow ache through your legs, a rhythm that becomes the background of your thoughts. Above, gulls circle without sound. Below, the water rolls endlessly, gray and heavy. There is no horizon worth looking for. The pirates who lived upon these waters were not the villains or heroes that later stories imagined. They were fragments of a broken system, the drifting remains of empires that used men until they were no longer useful. On a ship with no flag, loyalty meant survival. Every man was both brother and potential enemy. Trust was temporary, built on the fragile hope of another sunrise. When we picture them, the black flag snapping in the wind, the captain with his cutlass, the crew cheering over stolen treasure, we are remembering the dream, not the truth. In truth, the black flag was a warning of desperation more than defiance. It meant they had nothing left to lose. The gold they sought often rotted with them in the hold. Food spoiled, water turned foul, and the endless expanse of the ocean stripped away all illusions of power. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the ocean itself became an enemy. The salt ate through ropes, the humidity softened wood, and the heat drew disease out of every crevice. Men slept beside barrels of spoiled water and sacks of worm-eaten bread. They awoke, covered in sweat, salt, and insects. The same sea that carried them toward freedom slowly consumed the ships they lived on. Still, the myth of freedom endured, because it was all they had. On land, they were criminals. At sea, they were outlaws. Between the two, they found a strange kind of existence. They could vote for their captains, divide their spoils, punish the cruel, and reward the brave. But even this fragile equality rested upon violence. The same hands that voted one day might slit a throat the next. There is a quiet irony in their story. The pirate was both free and enslaved, freed from masters, enslaved to the sea. The water became their world, their home, and their grave. It offered no mercy, no rest, and no redemption. By night, the ship would drift under a black sky, the stars dull behind a haze of salt mist. The air would grow still and heavy, pressing against the lungs. Somewhere below deck, men would sleep in hammocks that swayed with the motion of the waves. The sound of snoring, coughing, and muttering filled the darkness. Rats scurried between barrels, gnawing at the heart. The smell of sweat and oil hung in the air like a second skin. Above, the lookout might hum a tune, not out of joy but to keep himself awake. The ocean gave them no silence, only repetition. The slap of waves against wood, the slow sigh of the wind, the creak of ropes. A ceaseless lullaby that blurred the edge between waking and dreaming. In that half-sleep, freedom began to lose its shape. It became something abstract. Not an escape, but a word whispered to oneself, to make endurance bearable. The true horror of piracy was not the bloodshed or the hanging ropes waiting in distant harbors. It was the emptiness, the slow realization that every horizon looked the same, that every ship they took was another brief distraction before hunger returned. The ocean swallowed time. Days blurred into one another. The mind drifted like the ship itself, without anchor. And yet, they kept sailing. Because the alternative, captivity, execution, or starvation on land was worse. The sea at least gave them a choice, however cruel. It was not freedom in any real sense, but it was motion, and motion gave the illusion of purpose. Somewhere within that illusion, the legend was born. Stories grew from silence. A sailor might tell of a captain who divided the spoils fairly, or of a ship that escaped an entire fleet. Each retelling softened the misery and sharpened the glory, until the world forgot what these men had actually endured. What survived in books and songs was only the dream, the shimmering surface, not the cold water beneath. As centuries passed, the dream hardened into myth. The pirate became the outlaw hero, the romantic rebel, the free man beneath the stars. But under all the fabrications, the truth still lies, buried beneath salt and silence. The real story of the pirate is not written in treasure maps or songs. It is written in the bones that lie beneath the waves, in the planks of ships long rotted away, in the faint records of trials, where the condemned spoke softly before the rope. And so, as we begin our long voyage through their world, let us set aside the myths and the laughter, the bright flags and the gleaming swords. Let us listen instead to the slow sound of the sea against the hull, the weary breath of men too tired to speak, and the quiet realization that freedom, when stripped bare, is rarely gentle. Tonight, we begin not with glory, but with hunger. The hunger that drove them to the edge of the world. As the 1600s faded into the 1700s, piracy spread across the world. Its warm waters from the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico to the coast of West Africa and the Indian Ocean. Most of the men who became pirates were former sailors from merchant ships or naval crews. Many had deserted after months without pay. Others had been shipwrecked or abandoned in foreign ports. For them, piracy was not a choice of greed, but a continuation of survival. The sea, already harsh, became their only employer. Daily life aboard a pirate ship centered around food and water, to resources that were never secure. The average crew numbered between 70 and 100 men, packed onto ships rarely more than 100 feet long. Space was minimal. Every barrel and crate mattered. The hold carried gunpowder, stolen goods, spare timber, and whatever food could be found after a raid. The food supply was simple: salted beef, salted pork, dried peas, and hardtack, a type of biscuit baked several times until it became hard as stone. The biscuit could last months without rotting, but it was often infested with weevils. Pirates would tap the biscuit on the table to shake out the insects before eating. It was not uncommon to eat the biscuit in the dark to avoid seeing what was inside. Meat spoiled quickly. Salted pork was preserved in barrels filled with brine, but the barrels often leaked. Without refrigeration, the meat became sour. Dried peas were boiled into thick stew, known as peas porridge, often cooked in the same greasy water, day after day. The smell of salt, meat, and smoke lingered across the deck, even when the pot was empty. Fresh water was rarer still. It was stored in wooden barrels, sealed with pitch. After a few weeks, the water became slimy and bitter. Algae grew inside, and a faint film floated on the surface. When water ran low, Men were forced to drink a mixture of water and rum to hide the taste. Rum became a daily ration. It dulled hunger and quieted fear, but also made the crew unpredictable and slow to react. During long voyages, hunting was almost impossible. The ships lacked time and equipment for fishing, and gunfire risked drawing attention from passing vessels. Some crews caught turtles when near the Caribbean islands, or along the coast of Central America, as turtle meat could be kept alive in the ship's hold for weeks. When all food ran out, they boiled leather straps or chewed on ropes soaked in seawater. Hunger shaped behavior. A crew that had not eaten well for weeks grew restless and violent. Small disputes over bread or rum could lead to fights. Captains had to ration food carefully. The articles, the written rules agreed upon by the crew, often included specific lines about equal distribution of rations. Any man caught hoarding could be punished or even killed. Fairness was essential, because a starving crew could mutiny without warning. The environment worsened the problem. The tropical heat spoiled supplies faster. In the Caribbean, temperatures regularly rose above 30 degrees Celsius. The constant humidity softened barrels and warped planks. Rats bred quickly in the holds, eating grain and biscuit. Fleas and lice spread disease. In the Indian Ocean, ships endured long calms when no wind filled the sails, trapping the crew under the burning sun for days. Men lay on deck in silence, conserving strength, their lips cracked from thirst. Even successful raids rarely solved the problem. Merchant ships carried goods, textiles, sugar, tobacco, and silver, but rarely food. A pirate ship might capture barrels of molasses or wine, but nothing that could feed the crew for long. Some raiders preferred to attack smaller coastal vessels because they carried livestock and fruit. Others seized the stores of naval ships, taking bread, beef, and beer when they could. Food, not gold, determined survival. In periods of scarcity, disease followed quickly. Malnutrition weakened the body. Without fresh fruit or vegetables, scorbia piered, a disease caused by the lack of vitamin C. The first signs were bleeding gums, loose teeth, and swollen joints. Flesh began to decay around old wounds. The condition could become fatal within weeks. Pirates did not understand the cause. Some believed it came from bad air in the hold, or from evil humors in the stomach. They tried to cure it with vinegar, salt water, or rum, none of which helped. Despite these hardships, there were moments of temporary relief. When a pirate ship anchored near a tropical island, small parties went ashore to gather coconuts, fish, or fresh water. Some islands, like New Providence in the Bahamas, became semi-permanent pirate bases. There, water could be refilled and ships repaired. But even these places were dangerous. Shallow reefs tore through holes, and diseases like malaria spread rapidly through the camps. The diet of a pirate rarely changed. A few lucky ships took live goats or chickens on board, though the animals often died quickly from heat and thirst. Some carried sacks of grain, but these were usually stolen or spoiled. Dried fruit was valuable and rare, reserved for the wounded or the captain. Ordinary crewmen lived mostly on salt, biscuit, and rum. Every mouthful was accompanied by the creak of the ship and the slow motion of the waves. Life at sea had no fixed schedule for meals. Work came first. Men climbed rigging, patched sails, cleaned decks, and manned the pumps to remove water leaking into the hull. Meals were eaten in short breaks, often standing. There were no tables, only crates and barrels. Wooden spoons and tin cups passed from one man to another, wiped on dirty sleeves. The air smelled constantly of smoke, sweat, and salt. Hunger and monotony blended into one another. There were few diversions. Some sailors carved wood, sang low songs, or told stories of ports they would never see again. Others slept as long as possible, conserving energy. The rhythm of the ocean replaced the rhythm of life on land. Days blurred into nights, weeks into months, and the mind drifted as steadily as the ship itself. Historical accounts from captured pirates confirmed these conditions. Testimonies recorded in London, Port Royal, and Boston described crews so thin that their clothes hung loose, their faces gray from exhaustion. The log of Captain Woods Rogers, who fought pirates in the Bahamas in 1718, noted that when he boarded a captured vessel, the crew appeared more like skeletons than men. their provisions long spoiled and their casks near dry. Archaeological finds from shipwrecks such as the Witta Galley, which sank off Cape Cod in 1717, show remains of salted meat barrels and biscuit fragments infested with insect eggs. Physical evidence of what these men endured. Piracy promised fortune, but hunger was constant. The vast majority of pirates never grew rich. Many died with empty stomachs and rotting teeth, buried at sea or abandoned on islands. Freedom meant little when every day was spent searching for the next meal. Hunger controlled every decision. When to fight, when to flee, and when to risk mutiny. It shaped the entire rhythm of their lives. The sea, vast and indifferent, gave them no mercy. Each sunrise brought the same endless horizon, the same thin stew, the same bitter water. The creak of ropes and the distant call of gulls marked time more reliably than any clock. Survival was measured not in days or victories, but in mouthfuls of bread, of water, of air. And so the myth of freedom continued, even as the men who lived it weakened. The horizon always promised something better. A merchant ship, a port, an island, a chance. But the sea of hunger followed wherever they went. As the months at sea stretched onward, hunger gave way to something quieter and far more persistent. Disease. It was not sudden. It came gradually, creeping through the ship like damp through old wood. The ocean gave no warning. It simply took the strongest men first, and the rest later. Most pirate ships had no surgeon. When one was present, he was rarely trained. Many were failed barbers or deserters from naval hospitals. The instruments, they carried knives, saws, needles, were rusted, washed only with seawater, and used again and again. The sick lay in the same spaces as the healthy. The smell of blood, sweat, and sickness filled the narrow hold where air barely moved. The most common illnesses were the same that plagued all sailors of the era. Scurvy, dysentery, typhus, and malaria appeared wherever food and water were scarce. The wooden decks were never clean. Waste was thrown overboard, but the smell remained. The combination of heat, moisture, and confinement turned every ship into a breeding ground for infection. Scurvy was constant. It came from the lack of fresh food. The body weakened slowly. First the gums swelled, then teeth loosened. Wounds refused to heal. Skin turned pale, then yellow. Some men lost the ability to stand. The British naval physician James Lind later proved in 1747 that citrus fruit could prevent the disease. But for pirates of the early 1700s, that discovery came too late. They did not know why men rotted alive, while others stayed strong for a little longer. Typhus appeared wherever lice spread. The insects lived in clothing seams and bedding, impossible to remove. Fever followed, then delirium. The sick muttered in their hammocks, sweating and shivering at once. When one man fell ill, the others soon followed. There was no isolation, no quarantine. A ship of 100 men could lose a third of its crew before reaching land. Dysentery came from spoiled food and water. It caused cramps, fever, and exhaustion. Buckets filled faster than they could be emptied. The smell spread everywhere. Weak men collapsed near the galley fire, too tired to stand. Some drank seawater when fresh water ran out, believing it would cleanse the body. It only worsened their suffering. When pirates sailed through tropical regions along the coast of Africa or into the Indian Ocean, they met malaria. The fever came at night, leaving them shaking and soaked in sweat. Without medicine, recovery was rare. The disease returned in cycles, leaving survivors weak for months. In the Caribbean, yellow fever was feared even more. It spread through mosquito bites, killing quickly. The skin and eyes turned yellow, the stomach filled with blood, and within days, the infected man was gone. On some ships, death came so often that burials became routine. The body would be wrapped in cloth or canvas, a cannonball tied to the feet, and dropped quietly into the sea. There were no prayers, only the sound of water closing over the dead. The wooden world of a pirate ship trapped everything. The air was thick with the smell of tar, sweat, and smoke. Hammocks hung close together. Men slept in their clothes. Their hair crawled with lice. Rats ran freely across their chests as they slept. Below deck, condensation dripped from the beams. The air felt heavy, damp, and sour. When a man was too sick to work, He lay still, while others stepped over him. There were no doctors to visit, no hospitals to reach. Sometimes a comrade would offer rum to dull the pain. Sometimes a knife ended the suffering. Death was not sudden or shocking. It was an accepted part of the voyage. The historian Marcus Rediker, in his study Villains of All Nations, described pirate ships as floating laboratories of human endurance. Archaeological records from wrecks such as the Queen Anne's Revenge, believed to be Blackbeard's flagship, confirm this. Human bones recovered from the wreck show evidence of healed fractures and infections. Proof of crude medical care performed with saws and iron tools. Treatment, when attempted, was simple and brutal. Boiled cloth served as bandage. Hot tar sealed wounds. Amputation was common for infected limbs. The patient was given rum or bite on leather to endure the pain. Few survived these operations. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky lived with fever until their bodies gave up. Personal hygiene was almost non-existent. Water was precious and never wasted on washing. Men rarely bathed. Clothes were not changed for weeks. Salt crusted on the skin. The scalp itched constantly. Teeth decayed and fell out. Some pirates filed their teeth into points or wore earrings, believing it prevented seasickness. None of it helped. The human body was simply not built for the ocean's monotony and dampness. The weather worsened everything. In the tropics, the heat made the ship feel like a furnace. In storms, the cold soaked every blanket and left no chance to dry. Sickness thrived in both extremes. In calm weather, flies and mosquitoes invaded. During tempests, exhaustion alone could kill. Men slipped from the rigging and disappeared into the waves, their names forgotten before morning. Despite the misery, few records mention the surviving testimonies of captured pirates men interrogated before execution show resignation more than anger. They spoke of bad air, of rotted meat, of bodies wasted by the voyage. They accepted it as normal. They had chosen the sea, and the sea demanded payment. Ships that stayed too long away from ports often became ghostly. The crew weakened, their movements slow. Eyes sank deep into their sockets. Voices turned hoarse. The line between sleep and death blurred. When rain finally came, men stood bareheaded on deck, mouths open, catching droplets like animals. When sickness consumed too many, the remaining crew abandoned their voyage. Some scuttled the ship and fled to nearby islands. Others joined healthier crews, spreading disease further. The Caribbean islands of New Providence, Tortuga, and Port Royal became centers not only of trade and drinking, but also of infection. Tavern owners described men collapsing at tables, their skin blotched and yellow. Medical understanding was primitive. Pirates, like most sailors of their age, believed illness came from bad air or divine punishment. Superstition replaced science. Some tied bits of coral or bone around their necks to ward off fever. Others tattooed symbols of the cross or the compass, hoping they would protect them from storms and sickness. It made no difference. The ocean remained the same, vast, indifferent, and patient. Disease shaped the lifespan of every pirate. Historical estimates suggest the average life expectancy for a pirate during the Golden Age was less than 2 years after turning to that life. Few survived long enough to grow old. Most died at sea, some on the gallows, and a handful in hiding. Their bodies fed the sea that had already taken everything else. When the ship moved on, the sickness moved with it. The next port, the next island, the next boyagi. Always the same pattern. Hunger first, then fever, then silence. The deck was scrubbed, the hammocks cleaned. The smell of vinegar burned in buckets. But the next cough always began soon after. The ship lived, breathed, and decayed like a body of its own. To the men aboard, the sea was both life and disease. It provided food, carried wind, and gave escape. But it also rotted the flesh and stole the senses. The waves rocked them to sleep at night and woke them with pain in the morning. Each sunrise revealed fewer faces. Each sunset, fewer voices. As the months turned 2 years, many crews lost their original members entirely. New recruits replaced the dead. Drawn by stories of gold, they found instead the same hunger, the same fever, the same endless motion. By then, The ship had become its own world, isolated, drifting, and quietly dying beneath the sun. And still they sailed, bound not by loyalty or hope, but by the slow rhythm of survival. Disease was not a battle to win. It was simply a companion, always present, always waiting. When men lived outside the reach of nations, they created laws of their own. Pirate ships were not governed by kings, parliaments, or admirals. They operated under what they called articles, a written agreement drawn up and signed before each voyage. The articles defined how plunder was to be divided, how discipline was to be maintained, and what punishments would follow if a man disobeyed. This system was not an invention of myth. Surviving records from captured pirates, preserved in court documents from London, Boston, and Nassau, confirm their existence and their precision. The Pirate Code, as it came to be known later, varied between crews, but most followed similar principles. The Articles of Bartholomew Roberts, drafted in 1721, listed 12 rules. Among them, no gambling with dice or cards, lights out at 8 o'clock, equal division of loot, and severe punishment for theft or cowardice. Another version, attributed to Captain John Phillips, punished any man who struck another with marooning, abandonment on a deserted island with a musket, powder, and water. Stealing from the ship's stores could mean whipping, mutilation, or death. Cowardice in battle was treated with equal severity. Pirate crews were made up of men who had been mistreated by naval and merchant captains. They sought equality, not hierarchy. In this limited sense, the pirate ship became a small democracy. The crew elected their captain and could remove him by vote when major decisions arose, such as whether to attack a ship or where to sail next. The vote of the majority decided. Every man had a voice, from the youngest sailor to the quartermaster, who acted as representative of the crew's interests. This structure mirrored no government on land. It existed only because the sea demanded cooperation. Without order, survival was impossible. The captain, though respected in combat, held limited authority in daily life. His power ended when the fighting stopped. The quartermaster controlled discipline, distributed provisions, and handled disputes. If a sailor felt cheated, he could appeal to the crew. These measures, described by the historian David Cordingly and confirmed by testimony from captured pirates, made the ship one of the most egalitarian workplaces of its time. Born not of ideology, but of necessity. Equal shares were the foundation of the code. When plunder was taken, it was counted openly. The captain received 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.5, the officers 1.25, and every ordinary seaman 1 share. Those injured in battle received compensation, known as smart money. A lost arm might be worth 600 pieces of 8. A lost leg, 500. These sums were high, but the promise of payment offered some reassurance to men who risked their lives in every skirmish. The system reduced resentment and encouraged loyalty. Yet justice on a pirate ship was swift and unforgiving. Drunkenness, laziness, or theft from a fellow sailor could bring whipping with a cat o' nine tails. A rope fitted with 9 knotted cords. More serious crimes, like mutiny or betrayal, ended with marooning or execution. Marooning, though simple, was a calculated punishment. The condemned man was left alone on an island with limited supplies. If he survived, he might be found by another ship. If not, he vanished into the sea. And the story ended there. Execution was rare, but decisive. When practiced, it was by hanging, shooting, or keel-hauling. Dragging the offender beneath the hull on a rope, scraping his skin against barnacles until he drowned or bled to death. Historical evidence suggests this was more common in naval fleets than among pirates. But the threat existed, and fear maintained order where laws could not. The code extended beyond punishment. Many articles forbade violence among crewmates. Some prohibited women or boys from being brought aboard, believing they caused disputes and distraction. Others demanded cleanliness of weapons, readiness for battle, and respect for the crew's collective decisions. If a man lost his nerve during combat, his punishment was loss of pay or abandonment at the next port. These rules kept the fragile community from collapsing into chaos. Even so, discipline depended on fairness. If a captain ignored the articles or seized more than a share, he risked mutiny. The mutiny that overthrew Captain Charles Vane in 1718 was one such case. His crew, angered by his refusal to engage in battle, voted him out and replaced him with Calico Jack Rackham. Such events were not rare. The power of command existed only as long as the crew believed in it. Pirate law also covered spoils from captured ships. When a prize was taken, valuables were listed and divided. Some portions were reserved for communal supplies, gunpowder, sails, and medical goods. Weapons were redistributed. Prisoners were questioned, sometimes ransomed, and then released or forced to join the crew. Many captured sailors accepted the offer, preferring the hardships of piracy to the brutality of naval life. For them, the articles represented a strange kind of justice, harsh but predictable. There were also rituals. When a new crew was formed, the articles were read aloud, often in the presence of the entire ship. Each man swore an oath of loyalty, sometimes on a Bible, sometimes on crossed pistols or a skull. Afterward, rum was distributed, and the voyage began. It was an informal ceremony, but it marked a clear divide between life under law and life outside it. Once the oath was taken, a man was beyond forgiveness in the eyes of Empire. Outside observers were often shocked by the order aboard pirate ships. Naval captains described them as disciplined and efficient in battle. Reports from the Royal Navy in 1719 noted that the pirates fight like devils, but keep command among themselves with uncommon severity. They were anarchists by reputation, but not in practice. Without structure, they would not have survived weeks or months at sea. Their ships were floating societies, temporary, fragile, but functional. The code was not born from rebellion alone. It was a mirror of injustice. Naval and merchant ships of the same era paid wages late or not at all. Officers hoarded food, beat men without reason, and ignored their deaths. The comparison piracy offered consistency, equal pay, clear rules, and mutual defense. A man could die of disease or hunger anywhere, but at least aboard a pirate ship, he knew why and when. These internal systems fascinated later historians. Somikayet, proto-democracies. Others saw them as survival mechanisms, simple agreements to prevent chaos among desperate men. Either way, they worked. Pirate crews, for all their lawlessness, maintained cohesion in conditions that destroyed ordinary fleets. When captured, many pirates spoke of their codes with pride. At trials in London and Jamaica, prisoners often mentioned that they had kept to their articles. It was their final defense that they had lived by their own law, even while breaking the laws of nations. The courts were unmoved. The articles could not protect them on land, but within the wooden walls of their ships, they had governed themselves more fairly than the societies that condemned them. As the decades passed, and the era of open piracy drew to an end, these codes disappeared with the men who wrote them. The documents that survived, smuggled into archives, quoted in court transcripts, preserved in books, remain the clearest record of how order existed in a world built from chaos. They show not freedom without rules, but equality within ruin. They remind us that even those who lived beyond the law could not escape the need for it. And so, as the tide of history carried the last pirate ships toward their slow decline, the code faded from memory. But for a brief moment, on the hot, swaying decks of ships that flew the black flag, men who had lost everything found a way to govern themselves. Their laws were crude, their justice swift, but within that fragile order lay their only chance at peace. The sea was every pirate's first and final master. He gave them freedom, food, and fortune, but it also destroyed their ships without hesitation. No law, no courage, and no prayer could control the weather. A storm could erase years of plunder in a single night. Most pirate vessels were small and already old before being stolen. They were built from oak and pine, held together by iron nails that rusted in salt air. Constant moisture softened the planks. Ropes stretched, sails tore, and every few hours men worked the pumps to remove water leaking into the hull. Even on calm days, the sea reminded them that wood and salt are never friends. The Caribbean, where many of them sailed, offered warmth and steady wind through most of the year. But between July and October, hurricanes formed far out in the Atlantic, moving west across open water. The ships had no barometers, no forecasts, and no safe harbor nearby. The first warning was silence. The air heavy, the horizon dark, the wind vanishing until the sea looked like glass. Then, within hours, the surface broke apart, and the sky folded down upon them. The hurricane of 1715 off Florida destroyed 11 Spanish treasure ships and killed more than 1,000 men. Wrecks from that fleet still wash ashore centuries later, proof of how little chance any wooden ship had. Pirates such as Henry Jennings and Charles Vane salvaged silver from those beaches, but they knew the same winds could easily bury them next. Storm preparations followed a pattern. Sails were reefed, ropes coiled, barrels lashed tight. The hatches were sealed with tarred cloth, and the crew waited below deck, sitting in the dark. When wind struck, it sounded like cannon fire. Lightning split the sky, and thunder shook the timbers. Men shouted, but voices vanished under the roar. If a mast snapped, it tore through the deck like a spear. Those who fell overboard disappeared instantly. No rescue was attempted. A ship in a storm could not turn back. The Witta Galley, commanded by Samuel Bellamy, was erected in 1717 off Cape Cod during such a gale. Of 146 men, only 2 survived. Excavations showed that the hull broke apart on sandbars, its contents scattered for miles. It was not a battle that ended Bellamy's life. It was the sea itself. Beyond the tropics, the North Atlantic punished them differently. Here, winter storms carried ice. Ropes froze solid, sails stiffened like boards, and water turned to slush across the deck. Men's hands stuck to metal when they tried to work. Ships became heavy with frozen spray, and many simply rolled and sank under their own weight. Those caught in fog near Newfoundland often vanished without trace. Calms were another kind of torture. When the wind stopped, the ocean became flat and silent. The sun burned the deck until tar melted between the planks. Water in the barrels went sour. Rations shrank. The air smelled of sweat, salt, and despair. Men lay motionless in the shade of the guns, waiting for a breath of wind. Sometimes it did not come for weeks. When at last a breeze touched the sails, the relief was physical, not joy, but release from captivity. Superstition filled the space that knowledge could not. Whistling on deck was thought to summon wind and therefore bad luck. Sailing on a Friday was avoided whenever possible. Some men carried small bones or coins tied around the neck to ward off lightning. Others scratched crosses into the masts before each voyage. They could not predict the weather, but they could pretend to bargain with it. Storms dictated when pirates sailed and when they hid. During hurricane months, many stayed near sheltered harbors such as Nassau or Tortuga, repairing sails and trading stolen goods. When the trade wind steadied, they went hunting again. The rhythm of piracy followed the rhythm of the sea, not the plans of men. The most successful captains were those who understood that the sky, not the sword, decided their fate. Contemporary naval logs and colonial reports confirm that more pirate ships were lost to weather than to combat. Between 1715 and 1725, of roughly 30 known pirate wrecks, fewer than 5 resulted from battle. The rest were destroyed by storms, grounded on reefs, or abandoned after structural failure. Decay was constant, even when not wrecked. Ships slowly disintegrated. Salt water rotted the seams. Barnacles ate the hull, and after only a few years, a once-proud vessel leaked so badly it had to be burned or scuttled. After every tempest came silence. The survivors pumped out the hold, replaced broken spars, and dried powder in the sun. The deck smelled of smoke and wet rope. Dead men were buried at sea, their bodies sewn into canvas with a cannonball at the feet. The sea accepted them without ceremony, closing over them as though nothing had happened. Work resumed the same day. There was no time for mourning. Survival was maintenance. The memory of storms haunted crews long after the wind died. Sailors spoke of phantom ships seen in lightning flashes, or voices carried on the wind. Modern historians call these illusions fatigue and dehydration, but for those who lived through them, they were reminders that the sea kept what it killed. Some pirates carved small marks into the mast for every storm survived. Quiet acknowledgments that life continued. Every voyage carried this uncertainty. One week might bring calm water and bright sky. The next, a hurricane that ended everything. The sea was not cruel in intention. only indifferent. It treated pirates, merchants, and navies alike. Their flags meant nothing to the waves. To live on the ocean was to accept that obedience did not guarantee safety. The only defense was patience, and patience rarely lasted long. Storms gave shape to their lives. They dictated hunger, timing, and route. They reminded every man that his strength was measured not in bravery but in endurance. When the horizon darkened, conversation stopped, and even the most reckless pirates grew silent. The sea demanded humility, and it took it by force. In the end, weather destroyed the age of piracy as effectively as navies did. Storms sank ships faster than governments could hunt them. The black flags faded not in battle, but in rain and wind. The ocean reclaimed its order, scattering broken planks across beaches and coral reefs. Those fragments still appear after hurricanes today. Silent evidence that the sea, as always, had the last word. Violence on a pirate ship did not always arrive with noise or blood. It lived quietly in the space between hunger and discipline, shaping how men looked at one another and how they held their knives. A constant presence that was less a moment of rage than the slow maintenance of order within a world where law no longer reached, and where survival depended on fear as much as cooperation. Every man aboard understood that a ship at sea carrying 100 armed outcasts in a space smaller than a city house required more than courage to stay afloat. It required obedience, and obedience, when not given freely, was extracted by threat. The stories of cheerful freedom beneath the black flag were later inventions simplified for land-bound audiences, who never smelled the ship's hold or heard the sound of boots on wet wood. In truth, pirate discipline was harsh, deliberate, and unrelenting, because a single act of disobedience could mean disaster. In the next storm or battle, authority began and ended with consent. Pirate captains were elected by vote, often by raising hands in the open air, and their rule lasted only as long as their crew believed they deserved it. During battle, their voice was law. Between battles, they were equals again, eating the same bread, drinking the same rum, and sleeping in the same filth. The ship's articles, those written agreements every man swore to obey, gave the captain limited powers: command in combat, guidance in navigation, and a larger share of the spoils, but they could not protect him from failure. When rations grew thin or prizes disappeared from the horizon, when the wind turned against them for too long, the same hands that had once lifted him high could just as easily remove him. The recorded mutiny of Charles Vane in 1718, preserved in colonial reports from Nassau, is perhaps the clearest example of this fragile order. Vane refused to attack a heavily armed French ship, calling retreat the wiser choice, but his men accused him of cowardice and voted to replace him with John Rackham, known as Calico Jack. The vote was swift, the decision final. Vane and a few loyal men were set adrift in a small boat with meager supplies, left to their fate. His death on the gallows a year later proved how quickly leadership at sea could shift from command to exile. This was not an isolated event. Many pirate captains met the same end, undone not by battle, but by their own crews, whose sense of fairness and fury mixed in equal measure. Violence was part of daily routine long before any mutiny began. It existed in the structure of work itself, the heavy lifting of cannon, the strain of rope burns, the constant awareness that another man's mistake could kill you. Arguments flared over rations, turns at the pump, or the division of loot. Knives appeared easily, and blood cooled quickly in the salt wind. The cat o' nine tails, a whip with 9 knotted cords hardened to thar, served as both punishment and reminder. A few lashes across the back restored obedience faster than speeches. For greater offenses, such as theft or insubordination, punishments became public. Men tied to the mast, whipped until flesh tore, then rubbed with vinegar or salt water to keep infection at bay. These acts were not expressions of cruelty. They were maintenance, the crude mechanism that held the ship together when fear of death was the only available discipline. When ships met in combat, the same logic applied. Contrary to later myths, pirates rarely sought battle for its own sake. Powder was precious, men were few, and wounds healed poorly. The Black Flag, the Jolly Roger, was intended to end fights before they began. The sight of a skull, an hourglass, or a bleeding heart against dark cloth sent a clear message: surrendered quickly and live. Resist and die without mercy. Most merchant captains Chose, surrender. The cargo was taken, the crew stripped of valuables, and the ship released. It was an economy of terror, efficient, predictable, and brutally practical. A pirate crew that lost men unnecessarily endangered its own survival. When violence did come, it came suddenly and ended fast. A pirate sloop would approach under a false flag, then raise the black as cannon fired into the enemy's rigging. Grappling hooks flew, ropes tightened, and the two ships locked together like closing jaws. Pistols cracked once or twice, and the rest was decided by axes and cutlasses. The noise was overwhelming. The crashing of wood, the shouting of orders, the scream of the wounded, and always the wind roaring through the torn sails. Within minutes, it was over. The defeated crew surrendered or died, and silence returned, broken only by the creak of the sea against the hull. Loot was counted, prisoners questioned, and decisions made with efficiency that bordered on ritual. Those who cooperated might be left alive. Those who fought or lied were executed, or, in rade cases, marooned on nearby shores with nothing but a musket and a single bullet. This ritual of violence extended inward as much as outward. The equality pirates prized demanded constant reinforcement through visible fairness and visible punishment. Every man received a written share of the spoils. Every man knew the rules of the ship, and every man knew what awaited him if he broke them. Such equality bred a strange kind of stability, but it also meant that when mutiny came, it came from below, and it was swift. There were no appeals, no courts, and no delay. A vote, a few shouted words, the thud of a body against the planks, and the matter was settled. Governments, watching from afar, understood how fragile these societies were. In 1718, King George I offered the Act of Grace, a royal pardon for all pirates who surrendered within a year. Hundreds accepted. Benjamin Hornigold, once a feared captain in the Bahamas, took the offer and turned privateer, hunting his former comrades under a legal flag. Others rejected the pardon, calling him traitor. The result was civil war among pirates, men who had once drunk together now chasing one another across the same waters they had shared. The final collapse of piracy owed as much to these internal divisions as to naval pursuit. By the early 1720s, pirate fleets had grown smaller and their unity weaker. Ships that once carried 100 men sailed with 30. Trust decayed with every rumor of betrayal. Hunger, disease, and fatigue did what cannon could not. Mutinies increased, discipline faltered, and alliances broke apart. Many ships surrendered without a fight when confronted by the Royal Navy. The dream of a floating republic, equal and free, had devolved into survival under constant suspicion. In the quiet hours between storms, men spoke in low voices of those they had killed or abandoned. There was no guilt in their words, only habit. They had come to accept violence as natural as the wind or the tide. It governed their meals, their votes, their friendships. Every relationship aboard was measured by the question, will this man stand beside me when the guns fire? Or will he turn against me when the rations run out? And so, the ship moved forward, fragile, armed, uneasy, and alive, through tension alone. Violence had become their language, and mutiny their punctuation. It was not madness or evil that sustained it, but necessity, the same cold arithmetic that ruled every part of life at sea. When the waves rose, they held the ropes together. When hunger struck, they fought one another for bread. When the horizon darkened with sails, they raised their flag and let fear do their work. In the end, violence was not what destroyed them. It was what kept them alive long enough to reach destruction. Freedom at sea was an illusion that disappeared within days of setting sail. A pirate ship might seem a symbol of escape, but for those who lived on it, it was little more than a moving cell. A confined, creaking space where men ate, slept, worked, and waited together in constant noise and heat. The open horizon promised endless possibility. Yet the world they inhabited was smaller than a city room, and it smelled of sweat, salt, and rot. Most pirate ships were captured merchant vessels, built for trade, not comfort. A typical sloop or brig measured under 30 meters from bow to stern and carried between 80 and 100 men. Below deck, ceilings were barely high enough for a man to crouch. The air was thick and warm, especially in tropical climates, where the wood sweated pitch and the lanterns burned weakly through smoke. Hammocks hung in layers, swaying with every movement of the waves, the constant rocking, the endless creak of beams, and the stifling closeness gave the sense that the ship itself breathed a slow, uneven respiration that surrounded the crew day and night. Space was never private. Men slept shoulder to shoulder, their bodies brushing in the dark. The smell of unwashed clothes, wet wood, and spoiled food lingered permanently. There was no laundry, no fresh water for bathing, no air circulation. Rats fed on crumbs and climbed over sleeping men. Cockroaches nested in barrels and clothing. Lice and fleas thrived. Every man scratched, and every man stank. Salt sores and skin infections spread ickly. No one spoke of comfort, only endurance. Daily life was repetitive. At sunrise, the cook lit the galley fire in a sand-filled pot and boiled salted meat or peas in greasy water. The smell of smoke mixed with tar, creating a haze that drifted through the ship. After breakfast came maintenance, scraping barnacles from the hull, repairing sails, splicing ropey and checking the rigging. At noon, a bell marked another shift. The heat grew unbearable, and the deck burned bare feet. Evening brought another ration of hardtack and rum. Then came silence, or something close to it. The distant slap of waves, the sigh of the wind through the rigging, and the endless creak of the hull. The monotony had a physical weight. The constant movement wore down muscles and minds alike. Men who had once worked in open fields or city ports now lived months without seeing land. They dreamed of green earth and still air. The ocean was too wide to understand, and too uniform to inspire. Days and nights merged into one another until time lost shape. The historian Marcus Rediker described this existence as the tyranny of motion without direction. The ship moved, yet nothing changed. Below deck, the air was heavy and foul, even in calm weather. Heat collected like steam. The lanterns smoked, the hammocks swung, and condensation dripped from the beams. During storms, water leaked through the seams and puddled on the floor. Men lay awake, listening to the water slosh beneath them, unsure whether it came from above or below. Buckets stood ready for bailing, and one man always kept watch at the pump. When the sea turned rough, sleep became impossible. Every crash of a wave felt like the sound of the ship breaking apart. Personal belongings were few. A knife, a spoon, perhaps a pipe. These were luxuries. Letters and small keepsakes were rare, often ruined by dampness or lost overboard. Everything rusted or rotted. Paper softened, fabric mildewed, leather turned to pulp. Even weapons needed constant care to keep rust away. Each man learned to live with as little as possible. The only real possessions were habits. How he tied his hammock, how he folded his clothes, how he stored his cup so it would not slide with the motion of the waves. The noise of the sea became a background hum that never ceased. Above, the sails snapped. The wind moaned through rigging, and ropes thudded against masts. Below, the groan of timbers sounded like voices in sleep. At first, sailors tried to ignore it. Later, they depended on it. Silence was more frightening than noise. When the sea grew still, men woke suddenly, uneasy, waiting for the next sound to break the quiet. Discipline enforced order inside this prison. The ship's articles demanded obedience, not because of cruelty, but because chaos meant death. Every man had a task. If the watch failed to see a sail, if the gunner neglected powder, or if a rope snapped from carelessness, the result could be fatal. Punishment was immediate. A thief might be flogged with a cat o' nine tails, tied to the mast and whipped until the skin tore. The lash left scars that never faded. More serious offenses, mutiny, cowardice, or treachery, brought marooning. The condemned was left on a small island with a pistol, powder, and water. Few were ever found alive again. The routine and confinement affected everyone's health. Many suffered from swollen gums, bleeding skin, and fatigue signs of scurvy, caused by lack of fresh fruit. The stench of spoiled food, smoke, and human waste filled the lower deck. Infection spread quickly. Men coughed without end. The floor was sticky with tar and grease. In such conditions, death came quietly, and the body was carried topside at dawn, sewn into canvas, and slipped into the sea. There were no prayers, only silence. Archaeological studies of known wrecks, such as the Widow Galley and the Queen Anne's Revenge, confirm the claustrophobic nature of these ships. Recovered items, pots, shackles, nails, and fragments of hammocks reveal how small and improvised everything was. The lack of personal space reflected necessity. Every inch of the ship served a purpose. Even so, the crew filled every corner until the ship itself seemed alive with restless movement. For all its misery, the floating prison also offered belonging. The men were bound together by shared survival. Each one depended on the others to keep the ship afloat. When storms passed or a prize was taken, the crew celebrated briefly with rum or song. Laughter echoed off the timbers, and for a few hours the prison felt almost like home. Then silence returned, and the same routine resumed. The paradox of pirate life was complete here. They had escaped the laws of nations, only to build their own laws inside a wooden cage. They had fled the tyranny of kings, yet they lived under the stricter tyranny of the sea. Their democracy existed within planks and ropes, beneath a sky that never changed. To call this freedom was to ignore the smell, the heat, and the fatigue that defined every day. And so the ship drifted a world within a world, floating between nothing and nowhere. Each sunrise looked the same as the last, and each night ended with the same sound. The low groan of the timbers, the endless breathing of the sea, and the quiet acceptance that this, for better or worse, was the only home they had left. As the years crept quietly past the height of their power, the world that had once allowed pirates to thrive began to close around them, with the slow inevitability of a tide rising against the hull of a stranded ship, not suddenly or with fury, but with steady pressure. That left no escape, and in that long, suffocating end lay the quiet dissolution of what men later called the golden age of piracy. The early 18th century had opened its seas to opportunity. European empires were rebuilding from wars fought across continents. Their navies stretched thin, their merchant fleets vast and vulnerable. Colonial governors looked the other way, while privateers, those legal pirates armed with royal commissions, plundered enemies under flags of legitimacy. But peace, when it finally came in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht, removed the reason for such violence, and thousands of sailors found themselves unemployed, adrift, and hungry. They knew the sea too well to abandon it, yet the sea offered them nothing but starvation, and so they turned to the only profession left that rewarded courage and cunning in equal measure. For a brief time, their rebellion worked. The Caribbean became a republic without borders, its harbors filled with stolen ships, its shores echoing with the language of every nation that had once ruled them. Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, served as the heart of this world. It was little more than a scattering of wooden huts and taverns around a shallow harbor, but for several years it stood as the closest thing the pirates ever had to a capital. A place where English deserters drank beside freed African sailors, where Spanish renegades traded with French smugglers, and where rules were written in rum rather than ink. Contemporary reports from British officials described Nassau as a nest of rogues, and they were not wrong. Yet what they feared most was not the drinking or the theft, but the independence. No empire controlled it, no flag flew above it, and for men who had spent their lives under the lash, that absence of authority felt like paradise. But paradise, as it does, began to rot from within. The same freedom that had drawn them also made unity impossible. Crews quarreled over spoils, captains fought for dominance, and disease spread through the crowded harbor. When supplies ran low, pirates turned on one another, attacking their own kind in desperate hunts for food or coin. By 1717, Nassau had become a ruin of its own legend, half burned, half abandoned, its taverns filled with the sound of arguments that ended in knives. The British government, alarmed by the loss of trade, decided to reclaim the sea it had neglected. It sent Woodes Rogers, a former privateer turned governor, with orders to restore law and order to the Bahamas. Rogers arrived in July 1718 with 2 warships and the king's pardon, known as the Act of Grace, offering forgiveness to any pirate who surrendered within a year. The effect was immediate and divisive. Some captains, weary of running and hungry for safety, accepted. Others rejected the offer as betrayal. The community that had once called itself Brotherhood split down the middle, its dream of freedom dissolving under the weight of choice. Benjamin Hornigold, once one of the most respected among them, took the pardon and turned against his former allies. hunting them with the same skill he had once used to raid merchants. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, refused. Teach's brief reign ended soon after. In November 1718, the Royal Navy cornered him off the coast of North Carolina at Ocracoke Inlet. The battle lasted less than an hour. Teach fought until surrounded, his body cut down with 5 gunshots and more than 20 sword wounds. His head, severed and hung from the bowsprit of the HMS Pearl, was carried to Virginia as proof of victory. His death marked not the final act of piracy, but its symbolic collapse, the moment when the myth began to fade into memory. In the following years, the pattern repeated. Charles Vane was captured and hanged in Jamaica. Calico Jack Rackham met the same fate alongside his companions and Bonnie and Mary Read, whose trial drew fascination because they were women, yet even their notoriety could not revive the dying age. Bartholomew Roberts, perhaps the most successful of them all, was killed in 1722 by the Royal Navy off the coast of Africa. His death ended organized piracy on a global scale. The Atlantic, once described by sailors as alive with black flags, fell silent again. The reasons for this decline were as practical as they were political. Naval power expanded, trade routes changed. Governors, once indifferent, now coordinated patrols. Insurance companies in London pressured Parliament for stronger enforcement. Even ship design evolved. Larger vessels, faster hulls, and better armed escorts left little room for small raiders. Piracy, which had thrived in the cracks of empire, could not survive when those cracks closed. For those few who escaped capture, the end came slowly. Some retired to remote islands under false names, living as fishermen or traders. Others joined colonial militias, pretending to be honest sailors. A handful were caught decades later, their tattoos betraying them to watchful officials no negro reach. The wealth they had stolen vanished as quickly as it was taken, spent on rum, women, and gambling, or lost to the sea in the next storm. The average pirate's career lasted less than 2 years. His life, on average, less than 30. When they died, no one recorded their names, except in court ledgers and gallows sermons. The world that replaced them was quieter, but also colder. Trade flourished, profits rose, and the same governments that once ignored them built empires from the commerce pirates had made possible. The Caribbean, tamed and taxed, became an extension of Europe's economy. The ports, once filled with laughter and mutiny, turned into naval stations. The sound of cannon fire was replaced by church bells, and the measured rhythm of bureaucratic order. Freedom, that brief experiment on stolen decks, had ended not with rebellion, but with exhaustion. And yet, even as their bodies disappeared beneath waves and their ships rotted into coral reefs, the memory of pirates refused to die. Ballads spread through taverns in London and Bristol, exaggerating their courage and their cruelty in equal measure. Writers turned them into symbols of defiance, men who had stood against kings and merchants alike. The truth, far duller and far sadder, lay in forgotten reports, lists of confiscated weapons, inventories of clothing, witness accounts that described hunger more often than heroism. Still, legend won, because legend could be told without the smell of rot or the ache of salt sores. By the time the last known pirate was hanged in 1726, the sea had already erased their traces. Storms scattered their wrecks across shoals and reefs, fish gnawed their bones, and coral grew around their cannon. The wind that had once filled their sails now passed over quiet waters, where trade ships moved safely under the flags of nations. But beneath those calm surfaces, beneath centuries of sand and silence, the fragments remain: anchors, coins, the outline of hulls, the ghostly evidence of a brief moment when the lawless ruled the waves. And so ended the Golden Age, not with thunder or glory, but with the same slow rhythm that had carried it forward from the beginning. The heaving of the sea, the creak of wood, the whisper of wind moving endlessly over the graves of men who had called it home. When the age of piracy began to crumble, justice arrived not in sudden fury, but through a slow, methodical tightening of the rope, both literal and symbolic, that stretched from the decks of their captured ships to the wooden scaffolds rising above harbors across the empire, where the bodies of the condemned would swing as silent reminders. That freedom on the sea always ended under the law of the land. The men who had once lived by their own codes now found themselves surrounded by the machinery of a different kind of order. Courtrooms filled with wigs and parchment judges, quoting statutes none of them could read, and gallows built high enough that the crowd could see every final breath. To the authorities who had tolerated them for years, these executions were not simple punishment. They were performance, carefully arranged spectacles, meant to erase the idea that law could ever be escaped. Captured pirates were brought to trial in chains, often after weeks or months, in the damp cells of Port Royal, Boston, or London. They had been seized at sea or betrayed by men who had taken the king's pardon, and by the time they faced the court, many were already broken, their clothes in tatters, their skin gray from illness, and their spirits dulled by confinement. Few had lawyers, fewer understood the charges. The Admiralty Court did not concern themselves with complexity. The verdict was almost always predetermined. Of every 100 accused, perhaps one received mercy, usually for turning witness against his captain. The rest heard the same sentence, read in the same calm tone: to be hanged by the neck until dead, and may God have mercy on your soul. The process itself was condemned men were marched through the streets to the harbor, escorted by soldiers, and followed by crowds who came to watch, not in cruelty but curiosity, for public execution was both punishment and entertainment. They walked with their hands bound, accompanied by a minister who murmured prayers. Few of them answered. Some remained silent. Others shouted to the onlookers, boasting of their courage or mocking the judges who had condemned them. A few wept openly. The gallows stood near the water, because the sea was their crime and their punishment alike. The smell of salt and tar hung in the air, the wind carrying fragments of hymns and laughter. At the foot of the scaffold, the condemned were allowed a final speech. Some begged forgiveness, others cursed their captors or warned their old comrades to flee. Records of these speeches, preserved in court transcripts and broadsheets, show that most spoke simply of regret, not for the murders or thefts, but for having been caught. Then the rope was placed around the neck, the hood drawn, and the trapdoor opened. The sound, a dull snap, a brief creak, was followed by silence. The body twitched once or twice, then hung still, turning gently in the wind. Executions of pirates were deliberately public. In Port Royal, Jamaica, the bodies were left to hang for days until the heat forced removal. In London, they were displayed at low tide along the Thames, their feet brushing the water, their faces turned toward the ships that passed. Iron cages called gibbets were used to preserve the corpses longer. The sun dried them, and birds fed upon them until nothing remained but bone and rope. Each display carried a plaque naming the man and his crime. The message was clear. The sea might hide you for a while, but the shore never forgot. The historian Peter L. described these exhibitions as sermons in wood and iron, and indeed they served the same purpose. Children were brought to watch. Merchants paused in their work. Sailors crossed themselves as they sailed past. Fear was the point. A dead pirate was worth more to the crown as a warning than he had ever been alive, and so they hung Samuel Bellamy, Charles Vane, Jack Rackham, and dozens more. Their stories carried away by the same wind that had once filled their sails. For those imprisoned rather than executed, the end was slower. Admiralty jails were dark and foul, with straw for bedding and chains fixed to the walls. Prisoners were fed bread and water. Disease spread quickly in the damp air. Letters from surviving guards described the stench as unbearable. Few lived long enough to serve their sentence. In Somikas's men who had accepted pardons were imprisoned again for new crimes. Proof that the promise of mercy rarely matched its delivery. The cruelty of these punishments reflected not only vengeance but fear. The Empire understood that piracy was more than theft. It was defiance, a rejection of every hierarchy that kept its world in place. To destroy the pirates physically was easy. To destroy their idea required spectacle. Every rope tightened around a neck was also a message to those who remained at sea. A reminder that the state could reach anywhere the wind carried its flag. Yet for all its certainty, this justice carried an undercurrent of hypocrisy, because many who condemned the pirates had once profited from them, selling their goods, drinking in their taverns, or hiring them as privateers in time of war. After 1725, as piracy dwindled, the gallows still stood, but the crowds grew smaller. Executions became routine, their meaning diluted by repetition. The ocean, indifferent to human law, continued to wash against the posts where the bodies had hung, bleaching the wood and erasing the stains. By the middle of the century, those same harbors were busy again with merchant traffic, and the memory of the pirates faded beneath the noise of trade. Their bones, taken down at last and buried in unmarked graves, left no trace beyond names written in brittle ink. But the silence that followed their deaths carried its own kind of persistence. In the taverns of coastal towns, old sailors told stories of men they had known, of captains who had defied the empire, of battles fought in moonlight, of treasure buried and never found. The listeners, warmed by drink, nodded solemnly, half believing, half dreaming. The gallows had claimed the bodies, but the imagination refused to let them go. Even the instruments of their punishment decayed. The wood rotted, the iron rusted, the ropes disintegrated. What had once been monuments to authority became forgotten relics, their remains washed away by the same tide that had once carried the condemned to their graves. The empire had succeeded in restoring order, but in doing so, it had immortalized its enemies. The pirates' defeat became their endurance. Their deaths were turned into stories, their suffering into symbols, and the gallows, intended to silence them, became the first stage of their myth. And so, long after the last executioner's knot had tightened, their shadows lingered in songs, in whispers, in the restless creak of ships sailing through the same waters where they had once ruled. Each time a rope strained against the mast, each time a flag snapped in the wind, the sound echoed faintly of the same justice that had ended their lives, and the same freedom they had dared to claim. When the last bodies were taken down from the gibbets, and the salt wind had scoured away the smell of death from the harbors, what remained of the pirate age was not its men or its ships, but its memory, which drifted across the years like the faint sound of waves heard through fog, reshaped by each retelling, each exaggeration, until the truth that had once been harsh and wet and heavy with labor became soft, distant, and golden in the imagination of those who would never know the sting of salt on an open wound or the creak of ropes in a storm. The transformation began almost immediately after their extinction. In London, printers hungry for scandal filled the void left by their absence with pages of half-truths and confessions, real or invented, sold for pennies in the streets. The most famous of these, A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724 under the name Captain Charles Johnson, gathered the fragments of testimony, gossip, and rumor that had circulated for years among sailors and merchants, and wove them into a narrative so vivid that it became indistinguishable from fact. Its pages described swaggering captains who toasted the devil, buried gold on lonely shores, and laughed in the face of the gallows. The book named names: Blackbeard, Bunny, Reed, Roberts, Vane, and gave each a story, a voice, a personality. To the literate public of Britain and Europe, these figures were no longer criminals. They were characters in a morality play where courage and rebellion stood against greed and empire. The same empire that had hanged them now found profit in their legend. Songs were written, stage plays performed, and ballads sung in taverns. Their flags, once forbidden symbols of terror, were stitched on handkerchiefs and souvenirs. The sailors who had feared them began to speak of them with a kind of reluctant admiration, remembering their boldness rather than their crimes. Within a generation, the pirates who had lived as fugitives became the folk heroes of the sea, outlaws who had defied tyranny and died unbowed. It was not true, but it was useful. An empire built on trade could afford romance more easily than rebellion, and the story of the pirate, tamed into myth, became an export as valuable as sugar or rum. Historians tracing this process note that the transformation from man to legend followed the same routes as their plunder had once taken, from the Caribbean to London, from ports to parlors, from memory to myth. What had been hunger became adventure. What had been filth became freedom. The harsh discipline of the floating prison faded into images of laughter on deck, of treasure chests, of loyal crews bound by brotherhood. The slow death of disease was replaced by the quick, noble duel. Even the gallows, once a tool of humiliation, became a stage for defiant last words. Reality, which had been made of tar, sweat, and fear, was stripped of weight and turned into story. The myth suited its time. The 18th century was an age of order, industry, an empire, and every empire needs its shadows. Pirates became symbols of what ordinary people could not be: free from law, from duty, from the long reach of taxation and kings. They were imagined as men who took what they wanted, sailed where they pleased, and answered to no one. In the coffee houses of London and Amsterdam, merchants who had built fortunes on colonial trade read about them with fascination, perhaps envy, and never noticed the irony. The same ships that had once carried the pirates' victims now carried their stories. In the colonies, memories were less romantic. In Jamaica, Barbados, and the Carolinas, the names of pirates remained tied to wrecks, storms, and fear. Local histories recorded not heroism but loss. The destruction of trade, the kidnapping of crews, the burning of ports. Farmers along the coast still found fragments of ships washed ashore after hurricanes, timbers with iron nails, cannon encrusted with coral, bottles sealed with pitch. These relics spoke of the real cost of that freedom. The hundreds who drowned nameless. The villages that vanished into poverty when the pirates came too close. Yet, Ibanair. The line between memory and myth blurred with time. Children grew up hearing that treasure was buried in the dunes, and every patch of sand seemed to hide a secret. Archaeology would later reveal that treasure, as imagined, almost never existed. Coins recovered from known wrecks. The Widagali, Queen Anne's Revenge, and others show cargo taken in trade rather than hoard. Gold and silver were rarely buried. They were spent quickly, exchanged for rum, women, weapons, and food. The true wealth of pirates lay in fleeting comfort and the illusion of control over their lives. But myths are stubborn, and centuries of repetition hardened these fictions into certainty. Even now, divers who descend into those cold, dark wrecks sometimes admit to feeling the weight of legend more than the pressure of water, as though in that silence the sea itself still remembers the sound of laughter from decks long gone. By the 19th century, the myth had become art. Romantic writers and painters reimagined the pirate as the ultimate outsider. Proud, passionate, doomed. Plays and novels gave him a conscience, a code, and a heart. He became an exile rather than a criminal, a man betrayed by society rather than condemned by it. The real pirates, whose lives had been short and miserable, would not have recognized themselves in these portraits. Yet the transformation was complete. The figure who had once hung in chains beside the Thames now strode boldly across the stage, dressed in velvet, speaking of liberty. The audience cheered, and the sea, though distant, seemed to echo faintly in applause. In time, the myth became global. Children in America and Europe grew up playing at pirates, waving wooden swords and shouting phrases that had never been spoken at sea. Maps marked with X's, parrots on shoulders, ships with billowing black sails, all inventions, all beautiful lies. Hollywood would later give these fantasies color and music, turning violence into adventure and hardship into charm. The pirates who had lived and died nameless became household names, carried into the modern world, not by wind, but by film reels and books. Yet beneath this glittering surface, the truth remains quietly unchanged. The men who once sailed under the black flag were not heroes or monsters, but laborers, poor, hungry, often desperate, bound together by circumstance and courage in equal measure. Their rebellion lasted barely a decade, their freedom always conditional, their lives shorter than the legends that replaced them. They were products of their time, sailors cast out by peace, soldiers without armies, citizens without nations, and their brief, violent independence reflected the same world that destroyed them. Even now, when historians open the old court records, the paper still smells faintly of salt and mildew. Each name, once shouted across a deck or whispered in a tavern, is followed by the same note: executed. But those same names, stripped of blood and hunger, continue to drift like ghosts through the stories told centuries later. The myth of piracy, once born from fear, has become a kind of lullaby, a dream of freedom sung by people who no longer remember what it cost. And so, in the long twilight between history and imagination, the pirates live on, not as men, but as ideas, fragments of rebellion that the sea, with all its patience, refuses to drown. Each wave that breaks upon the shore carries a trace of their echo, and each gust of wind over quiet water whispers the same refrain. The age of pirates is gone, but its shadow, like the horizon itself, will never end. Long after the last gallows was dismantled and the last confession faded from the walls of the old prisons, the sea continued to move in its unhurried rhythm, indifferent to memory and untouched by the moral conclusions of men, washing across the same routes that had once carried pirates, merchants, slaves, and soldiers alike, reducing every ship, every life, and every empire to the same quiet fragments beneath its surface. This impartial erasure that made no distinction between law and lawlessness, between those who plundered and those who preached justice. It is often said that the sea keeps its own records, and indeed it does, though they are not written in ink or paper, but in the layers of silt that gather over centuries, in the faint outlines of timbers half buried in sand, in the iron cannon crusted with coral and barnacles that still rest on the ocean floor where light cannot reach. The ships that once roared with laughter and song that shook under the weight of cannon fire and creaking masts now lie silent and broken, their decks collapsed, their ropes dissolved, their hulls hollowed out by creatures that know nothing of flags or nations. In this stillness, the ocean performs its quiet work of remembrance, not by preserving, but by consuming. Storms did not stop when the pirates vanished. The same winds that had once filled their sails now sweep over the same waters, forming the same spirals of destruction that occasionally unearth their bones. Divers who descend to the wrecks of ships, like the White Agli, Queen Anne's Revenge, and adventure galleys speak of a silence so complete it seems alive, broken only by the faint rasp of bubbles and the distant crack of shifting timber. They find buttons, buckles, coins, fragments of pottery, small objects, ordinary and human, their meanings long stripped away. The ocean gives nothing back whole. Each recovery is incomplete, each discovery already half erased by the element that preserved it. It is as if the sea allows brief glimpses into its memory only to remind us that time belongs to it, not to us. In the centuries since the last pirate fell, empires have risen and fallen in turn, their maps redrawn and renamed, their borders washed and rewritten by war. But the sea beneath those maps has remained unchanged. Its motion is too vast for politics, too patient for history. Ships still cross the same waters, following the same currents and winds that guided their wooden ancestors. But few who traveled them now think of the men who once called these waves home. Their world was smaller, measured not in coordinates or nations, but in horizon lines and tides, in the color of the sky before a storm, in the sound of wind shifting from north to east. It was a world that asked nothing of posterity. The pirates built no monuments, raised no cities, and left no descendants to guard their names. Their legacy, if such a word applies, exists only as motion, as the movement of water against stone, of wind against sail, of memory against forgetting. The sea takes everything because it must. It is both cradle and grave, both silence and noise. It consumes wood and flesh with the same grace, turning them into new forms of life. Coral, sand, fish, salt, even the wreckage that lies deepest, far beyond light, does not escape its touch. Pressure collapses the beams, water eats the iron, and the ship becomes part of the seabed, indistinguishable from it. In this, the pirates found their truest equality. All were claimed, in the end, by the same endless expanse that had once promised them freedom. Mariners of later generations told stories of ghost ships that appeared on the horizon before storms silent, black-rigged vessels gliding against the wind, their decks crowded with shadowed figures who neither waved nor spoke. Sailors swore they were the spirits of drowned pirates, still sailing the endless routes of their youth, unable to make landfall, forever paying for their rebellion in the currency of isolation. Superstition made these stories flourish, but at their heart lay truth. The sea does not forget easily, and in its depths, the boundary between history and haunting is thin. When modern explorers recover the remains of these ships, they treat them not as relics of crime but as echoes of human endurance. Museums display rusted pistols, compasses, and coins inside glass cases, illuminated by soft light, silent and clean. The glass separates air from water, the present from the past. but the objects remain uncomfortably alive, reminders that each belonged to someone whose name was once spoken aloud. Visitors stand quietly before them, reading the small plaques that summarize entire lives in a single line. Recovered from the wreck of the Wittigali, 1717. Behind that line lies hunger, laughter, terror, and death, all compressed into the stillness of display. The sea, though it has given these artifacts back, has kept their meaning. The erosion of the pirates' world was not merely physical. It was moral and psychological, too. As the centuries passed, the ocean became safer, mapped, predictable. Its mystery diminished. Lighthouses replaced fear with direction. Charts replaced instinct. Steam replaced wind. Where once the sea was an ungovernable expanse that bred rebellion, it became a corridor of commerce, policed and patrolled. The pirates' disappearance was not an accident of punishment, but an inevitability of progress. The natural consequence of control expanding into spaces that had once belonged to chaos. Yet the sea, vast and unyielding, remained beyond total command. Storms still sink ships. Currents still shift. And sometimes, after hurricanes, the bones of old wrecks reappear. Briefly, like memories surfacing through dreams. The ocean's capacity to erase is matched only by its ability to preserve. Wood that would rot on land can last centuries beneath silt. Iron becomes reef. A single shoe, a spoon, a piece of cloth hardened by salt. These survive long after the hand that held them has turned to dust. In this paradox, the pirates live on, neither entirely gone nor truly present, suspended in the equilibrium of the deep. They are not ghosts in the sense of storybooks. They are residues of existence, material and quiet, continuing their dissolution in the dark. There is something almost merciful in this ending. Unlike the gallows or the courts, the sea offers no humiliation, no spectacle, no judgment. It accepts the bodies without ceremony, covers them with layers of shifting sand, and lets the world move on. It neither condemns nor forgives. It simply folds the past into itself, endlessly recycling matter and memory into forms that no longer carry guilt or glory. The sea takes everything: ships, men, empires, and stories. And in doing so, it makes them equal again. And perhaps that is why its sound remains soothing even now. Centuries after the pirates vanished, beneath its constant rhythm lies a truth too large for fear or admiration. That everything built by hands, no matter how strong or defiant, returns eventually to water. The waves roll forward, indifferent and eternal, breaking gently on shores that remember nothing, whispering through their endless motion. The final lesson of the age of pirate, that in the end the sea keeps no masters and all who serve it are claimed by it in time. Long after the last sails of the black flag disappeared from the horizon, long after the salt had eaten away the ropes and the coral had claimed the cannons, the idea of the pirate refused to sink. It floated through time as if buoyed by the same currents that once carried their ships, drifting from history into folklore, from crime into romance, from the dark silence of the ocean floor into the bright noise of imagination, where it would find endless resurrection. The world that inherited this myth was different from the one that birthed it. By the late 18th century, the sea had been domesticated. Charts marked every depth. Maps turned coastlines into property, and trade routes became arteries of empire. The danger that once defined the ocean faded into reliability, and with it went the sense of mystery that had made the world both beautiful and terrifying. Yet human memory, like the sea, abhors stillness. In the quiet that followed order, people turned back to the chaos they had banished, reshaping it into story. Thus, the pirates, once symbols of hunger and rebellion, were resurrected as heroes of adventure, embodiments of a freedom no longer possible in the disciplined age of commerce. The process began with literature and spread like tidewater into every art book. Sakasa. General history of the pirates laid the groundwork, but it was later storytellers, the novelists, the playwrights, and eventually the filmmakers who gave the myth its permanent form. Their pirates wore fine coats instead of rags, spoke in wit rather than curses, and chased glory rather than survival. They became instruments of nostalgia, reflections of what industrial society had lost. the simplicity of danger, the purity of risk, the romance of uncertainty. Every age remade them according to its own hunger. For the Victorians, they were warnings against moral decay. For the Romantics, they were symbols of untamed spirit. For the modern world, they are entertainers, half-comic and half-tragic, moving across screens with the same grace that the real men never knew. And yet, behind every retelling, something real still murmurs. It can be heard in the sound of rigging against wind, in the hiss of surf along forgotten coasts, in the rhythm of labor that beats beneath every portrayal of adventure. The truth of piracy was never in its battles or treasures. It was in the endurance of men who refused to accept the hierarchies that defined their age, who turned necessity into rebellion and suffering into structure. That truth, stripped of glamour, remains the quiet undertone that gives the legend its power. Without it, the myth would have dissolved like foam. The persistence of this myth also speaks to humanity's longing for the forbidden. Civilization, for all its laws and progress, still admires those who break its rules. Intemperate people found a reflection of what they could not be: ruthless and free, certain of their own strength, untouched by bureaucracy or debt. The irony, of course, is that the real pirates were never free. Their democracy existed inside wooden walls, their liberty measured in rations and ropes. But myths do not depend on truth. They depend on need. The world needed a reminder that defiance could still exist, even if only as theater. As centuries passed, the myth evolved, but never disappeared. Children played at pirates on beaches and city streets, waving sticks as cut, their laughter echoing in the same rhythm as the waves that once carried ships to ruin. Adults, too, carried fragments of the fantasy in novels read by firelight, in the creak of wooden floors during storms, in the longing glance at horizons glimpsed from docks and windows. The pirate became an archetype as old as the traveler and as enduring as the sea itself. Every culture that touches the ocean eventually invents its own version of him. A thief, a rebel, a wanderer between worlds. The 20th century gave him new sails, made of celluloid and sound. Cinema transformed his rough hands into graceful gestures, his coarse shouts into polished speeches. The old violence was softened into choreography, and death became spectacle rather than consequence. Still, something in those moving images continued to hold the audience. It was not the treasure, nor the ships, but the unspoken melancholy that always followed. The understanding that freedom, once tasted, could never last, and that the sea, which seems infinite, is also the loneliest place on earth. Each film, each novel, each song that celebrated the pirate ended with silence, as if bowing to that truth. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, the real evidence of their lives continued to sleep in sand. Wrecks discovered off the coasts of the Americas and Africa in the 20th and 21st centuries revealed details the myths had long ignored. The simple wooden spoons, the hand-forged nails, the torn cloth wrapped around pistols. Archaeologists, unlike poets, found no gold, but plenty of labor. The bones recovered from these sites spoke not of adventure but of exhaustion. Fractures from heavy work, arthritis from endless motion, scurvy etched into teeth and ribs. These remains, catalogued carefully under glass, corrected the myth not by destroying it, but by grounding it. Proof that beneath every fantasy lies a body. And yet, the myth remains stubborn, beautiful, unrepentant. It returns every generation, as though summoned by the same tide that erases and rewrites the shore. The flags may change, the ships may modernize, but the longing for escape from duty, from hierarchy, from the slow machinery of civilization, persists. It whispers to the tired worker, to the dreaming child, to the reader turning pages late into the night. It says that somewhere across some horizon, a life without masters might still be possible, even if only for a moment. And though reason knows that horizon is unreachable, imagination keeps sailing toward it endlessly. The pirates themselves, if they could speak, might not recognize what they have become. Their names, once cursed in courts and whispered in taverns, are now spoken with affection, even admiration. Their graves, unmarked beneath waves and sand, have become places of pilgrimage for divers and dreamers. The black flag, once a warning of death, is now a decoration, printed on shirts, flown at festivals, turned into an emblem of rebellion without risk. It is a strange immortality, both hollow and kind. History's cruelty softened into metaphor, its noise transformed into song, and perhaps this is the sea's final act of mercy, to turn all who once defied it into stories that drift gently above its surface. The waves that swallowed their ships now carry their legends across the world, washing up on screens, in books, in the imaginations of those who lie awake, listening to the hum of oceans they may never see. Every retelling is another ripple, another reflection of that first restless desire to live without chains, no matter how impossible. And so, while the real sea continues its endless work of erasure, the imagined sea, vast and eternal, keeps them alive. The myth of the pirate endures because the sea itself endures, deep, mysterious, untamed, and always calling. It is the sound beneath sleep, the whisper behind every story of courage and loss, the soft rhythm that reminds us that freedom, like the tea, always returns for a while before receding again. And in that rhythm, steady, patient, and indifferent, the ghosts of the old ships still drift, their sails full of nothing but memory, their journey without destination, their legend without end. Beneath the fluttering black flags that once haunted the coasts of the Caribbean and the warm blue edges of the Indian Ocean, there existed a society unlike any other, fragile, temporary, and self-contained. A brotherhood of men bound not by loyalty or nation, but by necessity, by the relentless pull of hunger and the shared defiance of every rule that had once governed their lives. A community that lived together, fought together, and, more often than not, died together beneath the same stars that guided their stolen ships. The world they built upon those wooden decks was as small as it was intense. In that confined space, surrounded by the endlessness of the sea, men from a dozen countries found themselves bound by circumstance. There were English and French sailors who had deserted the navy, Africans freed or escaped from slave ships, Irishmen driven by famine, Dutchmen, Spaniards, and even a few Native Americans who had fled colonial servitude. Together, they spoke in a language that was no one's native tongue, a mixture of English, Dutch, Portuguese, and African Creole, known by later scholars as the lingua franca of the sea. It was crude, efficient, and full of borrowed words, proof that necessity, not politics, shaped their union. This rough fraternity called itself the Brethren of the Coast. It was less a title than an attitude, a recognition that survival depended on equality, that no man could command another by birth or by wealth, and that the only authority was competence. Tohoina. Crew 1 swore an oath upon the ship's articles, a document drafted and agreed upon collectively, outlining every share of plunder, every rule of conduct, and every punishment for disobedience. These articles, copied by hand and signed with marks by men who could not read, were the constitution of their floating world. Every man had a vote. Every man had a share. Every man, no matter how low his birth, had a voice in decisions that could mean life or death. It was crude democracy, born from necessity, but for many, it was the first taste of equality they had ever known. Yet, equality on the open sea was never peaceful. The same independence that gave them strength also seeded conflict. When spoils were few or leadership faltered, arguments erupted quickly and ended violently. Fists, knives, and pistols settled disputes more often than words. Even so, within that violence lay a strange order. A pirate captain, though elected, could be removed at any moment by vote. The quartermaster, second in command, represented the crew's interests and guarded against tyranny. In this balance between authority and rebellion lay the fragile stability that kept the ship from tearing itself apart. It was a world suspended between freedom and chaos, a political experiment afloat on salt and desperation, beneath the surface of camaraderie. However, betrayal waited like a current beneath calm water. Greed could corrode even the strongest oaths. Men who shared bread in the morning could draw blades by nightfall. A dispute over gold, a woman, or even an insult could end in blood. Pirate law demanded fairness, but fairness was a fragile concept when the reward glittered in one's hand. To steal from one's shipmates was a crime punished harshly, sometimes by maroon, sometimes by death, yet theft persisted. because temptation was as constant as the tide. The sea, for all its vastness, offered no escape from envy. Still, brotherhood endured. It endured in the songs sung around lanterns during calm nights, in the sharing of water during long droughts, in the silent cooperation of battle when men stood shoulder to shoulder, trusting their lives to one another's steadiness. It endured in the burial of comrades, when bodies wrapped in canvas were slid quietly into the sea, and the entire crew stood in silence, hats removed, as the waves closed over their dead. It endured in laughter, in shared meals of spoiled meat and stale bread, in the crude humor that softened the edges of fear. The pirates' solidarity was not noble. It was practical, born from the knowledge that without it, they would not survive a week. But in that practicality, something human persisted. A rough compassion, a sense that all men, in the face of the sea, were equal. Historians studying these ships describe them as early laboratories of labor politics, microcosms of fairness, formed in defiance of the strict hierarchies that ruled both navies and nations. PE was equalized, leadership was accountable, and even the wounded were compensated. A man who lost a limb in battle received a specific share of gold as recompense, a recognition of both his courage and his loss. This policy, simple as it seems, set pirate ships apart from every other institution of their age. In the merchant fleets and navies of Europe, sailors were beaten, starved, and discarded. In piracy, for all its brutality, the same men found dignity. And yet, brotherhood could not survive forever under the weight of hunger and fear. Each man knew that trust lasted only as long as luck. When storms scattered ships, or patrols hunted them too closely, or the prizes dried up, suspicion crept in like rot in the hull. Who had spoken to the authorities? Who had taken more than his share? Who had lost the will to fight? These questions never left the deck. At night, when the sea was calm and the stars sharp above, the crew lay awake, listening to the creak of ropes, and wondering which of their brothers might sell them for a pardon. There are records of betrayals so abrupt, they seem almost accidental. Crews divided mid-voyage, captains abandoned by their men, ships surrendered to naval patrols by quartermasters seeking safety. Sometimes, betrayal came not from greed but exhaustion. Years of running, fighting, and starving could turn defiance into despair. Men who had once sworn eternal brotherhood walked quietly into ports and gave themselves up, naming their comrades in exchange for mercy that never came. In the end, the greatest enemy of the pirate was not the navy or the gallows, but the slow erosion of faith in one another. Still, it is important to remember that this fragile fellowship, however brief, however flawed, was real. In a world ruled by kings and merchants, these men, outcasts, built a society on water that acknowledged no crown and bowed to no church. Their loyalty was imperfect, their justice crude, but within their floating world there existed a reflection of something universal. The desire to belong, to trust, to share both danger and reward. And though betrayal was inevitable, the memory of brotherhood lingered, as persistent as the scent of tar and salt that clung to their clothes. Modern historians reading the faded copies of pirate articles preserved in archives find not merely lists of rules but traces of humanity. Agreements to care for the injured, to divide wealth evenly, to avenge fallen comrades, and to bury the dead with dignity. These were not the laws of savagers, but of men who had known injustice and refused to repeat it among themselves. Their world was violent, yes, but also astonishingly organized. A floating republic that existed for only a heartbeat in the great turning of time, and yet left a mark as deep as any carved monument. Brotherhood and betrayal were the twin pillars of that existence. They sustained each other, each necessary to the other's meaning. Without betrayal, brotherhood would have been an illusion. Without brotherhood, betrayal would have been meaningless. Together they formed the rhythm of pirate life, unity in danger, suspicion in safety, loyalty until the next storm. And when the last ship sank, when the last crewman's body slipped beneath the waves, both concepts sank with them, leaving only their echoes, faint, irregular, and unending, drifting across the centuries like the fading sound of oars in calm water. And so, beneath the black flag, men lived and died as brothers, enemies, dreamers, and sorbivores all at once. all within arm's reach of one another, bound together not by faith or nation, but by the sea, which promised everything and kept nothing. Though the sails of the black flag were torn away by time and the bones of the men who raised them long dissolved into the seabed, the shadow they cast did not fade with their disappearance. The fear they once inspired reshaped the very order of the oceans, forcing nations to build new systems of control, new laws, and new ways of thinking about the sea itself. The pirates, through their defiance and their crimes, transformed the world they once terrorized, leaving behind not ruins, but structure, an invisible legacy written, not in blood or gold, but in the codes, patrols, and boundaries that still govern the waves today. When piracy reached its height in the early 18th century, the oceans were vast and ungoverned. Nations owned coasts, not currents. The open sea was a liminal place, neither land nor empire, where jurisdiction ended at the horizon. It was this emptiness that made piracy possible. Merchant fleets crisscrossed the Atlantic, carrying sugar, tobacco, coffee, and slaves, while colonial governments struggled to guard the thousands of miles that separated their ports. The pirates exploited that distance, the gap between command and reach. They existed in the spaces between maps, in the pauses of law, and in doing so, they revealed to the world how fragile the machinery of empire truly was. Their attacks were not merely acts of theft, but of disruption. A single captured ship could ruin a merchant house. A single lost convoy could bankrupt a colony. The pirates were small in number, perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 men at their height. Yet they terrified entire economies. Insurance rates soared, trade slowed, and ports trembled at rumors of black sails on the horizon. Governors wrote panicked letters to London, pleading for ships and soldiers. The merchants of Bristol and Amsterdam demanded naval escorts. The East India Company, which had once dismissed the problem as distant noise, began arming its own vessels. In response, the great powers of Europe turned their attention seaward, and what followed was nothing less than the birth of the modern maritime state. Navies grew from coastal defense forces into instruments of global policing. Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands built fleets capable of crossing oceans, not merely defending them. Shipyards in Portsmouth and Toulon labored day and night. Naval academies were founded, officers trained, and laws rewritten to grant authority far beyond territorial waters. The very concept of international waters, that vast space between nations, emerged as a response to piracy. What had once been wilderness became jurisdiction. The sea was tamed by bureaucracy before it was ever conquered by cannon. The admiralty courts, created to try pirates efficiently, became templates for modern maritime law. Their rules of evidence, their standards of command responsibility, and even their procedures for salvage and insurance endured long after the last pirate was hanged. The idea that a crime committed on the high seas was an offense against all nations, a hostis humani generis, an enemy of mankind, entered legal doctrine during these years. It remains there still, applied now to crimes like slavery, war atrocities, and terrorism. The pirates who had once mocked law thus became its architects. Unwilling though they were, fear of piracy also changed geography. Ports once left unguarded grew into fortified harbors. Coastal watchtowers were built from North Africa to the Caribbean, each within sight of the next, their fires and flags ready to warn of approaching ships. Settlements that had lived by isolation now lived by vigilance. Even the design of ships evolved. Faster hulls, broader decks, and heavier guns. Naval architecture became an arms race against an enemy that built nothing but destruction. In chasing the pirates, nations taught themselves to dominate the sea. The Caribbean, once the pirates' playground, was the first to feel this transformation. British warships patrolled Nassau, Port Royal, and Tortuga, not merely to defend, but to occupy. The French and Spanish followed. Trade lanes that had once meandered with the winds became fixed routes under military escort. Smugglers found fewer harbors to hide in. Merchants found more profit under protection. By the mid-1700s, the region that had once been a patchwork of outlaw enclaves had become a network of imperial control, its ports walled with customs houses, its coasts marked by flags. What had been chaos became system. Beyond the Atlantic, the same pattern repeated. Along the Barbary coast, where North African corsairs preyed on Mediterranean commerce, European powers extended the lessons learned from the Caribbean. The treaties, blockades, and bombardments that followed were justified as the suppression of piracy, though they were equally acts of expansion. In the Indian Ocean, where pirates once raided East India Company ships, the British Navy established permanent bases at Bombay, Madras, and later Singapore. Each a fortress born from fear. By eradicating the pirates, the empires gave themselves the moral language to occupy the world. The legacy of fear also reached the minds of ordinary sailors. For generations, the tales of pirates were used as warnings against disobedience. Captains in the Royal Navy invoked them before battle or punishment. Remember what became of the Black Flag? The pirate became a symbol of both terror and temptation, proof of what happened when discipline failed, but also of what freedom looked like beyond it. Every lash on a sailor's back, every shouted order in the storm, carried the echo of that warning. The Black Flag had vanished, but its memory kept the men in line. Even the economy reshaped itself around this memory. The rise of marine insurance, convoy systems, and naval escorts all stemmed from the centuries-long struggle to make trade predictable. The world's first global financial markets, the Lloyd's coffee houses of London, grew rich on the risk once embodied by piracy. The fear of lawlessness at sea became the foundation of modern capitalism's need for security. In this way, the pirates, though dead, remained participants in every voyage that followed. Their ghosts lingered in ledgers and contracts, in tariffs and timetables, in the steady hum of commerce they had once sought to destroy. And yet, the irony of their legacy is that they succeeded where they had not intended. By defying the world, they forced it to strengthen itself. Their rebellion, short-lived and bloody, compelled the empires to perfect their systems of order, to unify their laws, and to reach farther than ever before. Without them, the world's oceans might have remained wilderness for another century. The pirates taught civilization to fear the sea, and through that fear, to master it. Today, when cargo ships cross the globe under the surveillance of satellites and the protection of international navies, their routes trace the same lines once sailed by those who flew the Jolly Roger. The laws that keep them safe, the treaties, the patrols, the courts, are the quiet descendants of a war fought not between nations, but between order and chaos. Every modern port, every lighthouse, every maritime code is a monument to that conflict, built not for glory, but for control. The pirates did not know they were shaping the future. They were men of the moment, living hand to mouth, thinking no further than the next meal or storm. Yet in dying, they changed the nature of fear. They transformed it from a private terror into a public institution. A fear so organized, so permanent, that it became invisible. The calmness of today's seas is not peace, but vigilance. It is the echo of that old dread, structured and civilized. And as the waves continue to move in their timeless rhythm, washing against coasts that once burned with cannon fire, the sea remembers both sides of the story. The chaos that forced order, and the order that needed chaos to define itself. The pirates may have vanished, but the shape of their absence remains outlined in law and history, and in the quiet fear that still moves through the depths, whispering to those who listen closely that the sea was never truly conquered, only contained. As the waves move endlessly beneath the slow turning of the sky, and as centuries drift like clouds across the memory of the sea, the story of the pirates comes to its quiet conclusion, not with thunder, not with the crash of cannon fire, but with stillness, with the long exhalation of history settling into silence. The black flags that once frightened empires have turned to legend, their fabric long dissolved into salt and current. The names that once echoed across taverns and courts, Blackbeard, Vane Rackham, Bonnie Reed Roberts, are now only syllables carried faintly on the wind, their meanings softened by time until they belong more to imagination than to fact. And yet, though the men are gone and their ships long buried beneath Cortland sand, something of their presence lingers in the rhythm of the waves. The sea, after all, has no memory for individuals, but holds the residue of all who have crossed it. The traces of their sweat, their fear, their hope. The pirates, like the merchants and navies they defied, became part of that vast cycle. Their bones nourished the same waters they once commanded. Their stories, stripped of noise, became part of the collective murmur of the ocean that continues even now. an eternal background sound beneath the turning world. To think of them clearly, one must strip away the romance and look at what truly was. These were not kings of the sea, nor symbols of unbroken freedom, but working men, fugitives from systems that gave them nothing. They were sailors who turned their backs on flag and faith because the sea offered, at least for a while, a kind of equality they had never known on land. They were products of empire, its waste, its cruelty, its excess, and in rebelling against it, they revealed its weaknesses. For a brief moment, they built a different order. Harsh, fragile, but undeniably human. That small democracy on the waves, born of starvation and mutiny, left an echo far louder than the sound of their guns. Their lives were short. Most lasted no more than 2 years, as pirates before the gallows or the sea claimed them. They lived without certainty, slept beside weapons, ate when they could, fought when they must. They knew hunger more often than triumph, and fear more often than freedom. Yet within that narrow span of existence, they experienced something few of their time ever did. Control over their own fate, even if it led only to destruction. To modern eyes, that defiance, however doomed, still holds a kind of melancholy beauty. It is easy now, from the safety of history, to see their story as inevitable. Rebellion, rise, collapse, and myth. But for those who lived it, there was no pattern, only the sea. Each day was the same, and yet unpredictable. Each dawn brought wind or calm. Each night, silence or pursuit. Theirs was not a story told in chapters, but in tides. It rose, it fell, and it returned again, like the endless motion of the element that shaped it. In their disappearance lies a truth about all human endeavors. The sea takes everything, but it gives back meaning. It erases the particulars, the faces, the flags, the battles, and leaves behind only the idea of endurance. The pirates, despite their crimes, belonged to that same lineage as the explorers, the fishermen, the merchants. They were people who lived at the mercy of the sea and learned to find dignity in its indifference. In the long view of time, the distinctions blur. A shipwreck looks the same, whether it carried a king's treasure or a stolen coin. The coral grows over all, equally. The quiet horizon, stretching forever before them, was both their freedom and their prison. It offered escape but demanded everything in return. Many of them must have stood on deck at dusk. They went soft the light fading and felt the vastness press upon them. The knowledge that they had traded one kind of captivity for another. In the end, the sea was not a refuge from the world, but a mirror of it, reflecting every cruelty and every grace back at those who sailed upon it. And when their time ended, when the governments that had ignored them finally gathered strength and order returned to the waters, the world they had defied absorbed their lessons and moved on. The empires grew stronger, the laws more precise, the ships faster and safer. The pirates had forced civilization to organize itself against chaos, and in doing so, they helped build the very systems that ensured they could never rise again. Their defeat was also their contribution, an unintentional bequest to the stability that would replace them. Yet the story did not end there. It drifted forward, softer, reshaped by each generation into something more bearable, more beautiful. What had been suffering became adventure. What had been terror became freedom. What had been desperation became legend. The black flag became a symbol not of death, but of defiance. And the pirates, once hunted as vermin, became the dreamers of the sea. Even now, when people look out across the ocean, from the deck of a ship, from a coastal road, or from the window of an airplane, tracing the invisible lines of the old trade routes, they sometimes feel a faint stirring. A recognition without words. It is not the call of treasure or rebellion, but something quieter. The memory of those who once believed that the horizon could lead them beyond every boundary. It is a dream as old as navigation, as persistent as tide, and as unreachable as the line where sky meets water. And so, the story of the pirates ends, not with victory or justice, but with balance. The sea reclaiming its calm, the world continuing its motion, and the names of the lawless reduced to whispers among the waves. The ocean remains what it has always been, vast, impartial, and eternal. It keeps no record of its travelers. It erases cruelty and courage alike, grinding them into the same salt that fills its depths. Still, for those who listen closely, in the hush between waves, in the low hum of a harbor at night, there is an echo. It is faint, rhythmic, almost like breathing. It is the sound of old timbers shifting, of forgotten songs carried by wind, of men whose laughter once cut through storms. It is the sound of the past refusing to vanish completely. And as you drift, now, listening, perhaps half awake, perhaps nearly asleep, the sea continues its whispering, endless and even, repeating the same lesson it has given to every generation before. That freedom is never still, that memory is never safe, and that everything, even history itself, eventually returns to the quiet horizon, where the water meets the sky, and the story begins again. And so, as the waves continue their patient rhythm and the night deepens around us, the story of the pirates fades into stillness. Their ships are gone, their voices long silent, yet the sea they once crossed remains unchanged, vast, tireless, and unjudging. Every motion of its surface is a memory repeating itself. Every whisper of its tide a reminder that nothing is ever truly lost, only transformed. Somewhere beyond the edge of sight, where the water darkens into infinity, the horizon waits, calm, quiet, and endless. And if you listen closely beneath the hush of wind and the soft murmur of waves, you might almost hear them still. The faint creak of wood, the pull of a sail, the low song of men who once believed they could outrun the world. Now as you rest, let the sound of the ocean carry you there. Not to war, not to treasure, but to peace, to the slow, unending rhythm that connects all who have ever sailed, dreamed, or drifted across the deep. Sleep well, traveler of history. The sea keeps its watch. The tide will rise again.